Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. This is the International Association of Universities calling. We're very, very glad that you're joining us today on this webinar with the title Equitable Access and Success in Higher Education, Mapping the Future Agenda. This is a co-production with Graham Atherton of WAHEN, the World Access to Higher Education Network. We're very, very glad to be partnering with WAHEN for this webinar today. And it is indeed part of the International Association of Universities series that we have every month on the future of higher education. We're very glad to have you all on board and join us for this, which I hope will be a very vibrant discussion on access and success in higher education. And it gives me great pleasure to have wonderful speakers here with us today from all corners of the world, which is indeed the scope and represents the scope of the IAU indeed. What we are going to be speaking about is access and higher education. And let me just quickly introduce you to the theme and some of the problems that we are seeing, and then we will be able to enjoy the presentations from our distinguished panelists. There is a higher education, and the right to higher education has been enshrined in international law, and it's been around for quite some time. The right to higher education is enshrined in Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. Now, this was signed by the member states of the United Nations in 1963. There's a second piece of legislation which is of interest. It's the Article 13 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and is frequently referenced in the discussion on higher education as well. It's been ratified by 169 countries worldwide. It reads, education shall be directed to the full development of human personality and the sense of its dignity, and shall strengthen the respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms. And this is important. Education shall enable all persons to participate effectively in a free society. Now, of course, we have also the SDG, especially 4.3, which states that by 2030, it should be ensured that equal access for all women and men to affordable, quality, technical, vocational, and tertiary education, including university, should be achieved. A lot of progress has been made over the last years, especially in the last 20 years. And I'm sure that Francesco will be talking to us about data on this. But in the last 20 years, higher education has seen a gross enrollment rate worldwide, which had almost doubled from 19% to 38% between 2000 and 2018. Now, we have many reasons for this. Some would be through massification of higher education, through a rapid expansion of tertiary enrollment, and possibly other factors that we will have the pleasure of debating. Yet we do see barriers across the board, barriers within all jurisdictions. And this could be high tuition costs, insufficient supply of higher education, poverty, ethnic background, gender, disability, age, socio-cultural barriers, access for migrants, access for those wishing to enter from a different higher education system. So here the key word would be academic mobility. And these are just some of the barriers preventing equal access in the contemporary tertiary landscape. Now, if we have the legal framework I spoke to you about, what is then hindering us from achieving equal access and success in higher education? If the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed in 1963, where are we at 50 years, almost 50 years later, and where are we heading? To discuss this, we have the wonderful, wonderful panelists, Graham Atherton from the World Access of Higher Education Network and professor at the University of London. We have before us Francesc Pedro, UNESCO from the International Institute of Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. Then the pleasure is ours. Vivian Lavac, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic of the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, and Nino Schmidt, co-chair of the Bologna Follow-up Group, Social Dimension, and Executive Director of the Institute for the Development of Education, calling from Zagreb in Croatia. The idea was to give each speaker the floor to elaborate on their own institutional and regional perspectives, to hear from them on underlying concepts, definitions of this debate, initiatives and activities on access and success, and then a personal reflection on what needs to be done in the local and global context. 10 minutes each for a presentation, and then we will enjoy a panel discussion. Thank you very, very much. And Graham, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andreas. So, as Andreas said, my name is Graham Allerton. I am based in the UK, and primarily my work is involved with directing and leading an organisation called the National Education Opportunities Network, or NEON, which is a national organisation for access to higher education in the UK. We're a membership organisation with over 150 members, over 100 universities as members. We support them in their equitable access and success work via training, research, advocacy, etc. We also, NEON, have been very involved globally over the last decade or so. Particularly, as I'll talk about in a moment, convening something called World Access to Higher Education Day, an offshoot of that, the World Access to Higher Education Network. We've been attempting over the past 6 months to develop and launch an organisation for universities and others across the world who are committed to equitable access and success, enabling us to share practice, improve our knowledge, and drive this agenda forward. Today, I'm going to speak about 5 particular challenges associated with equitable access and success in higher education globally. I'm sure there are more than 5, but there are 5 I really want to focus my comments and remarks on today. What's the first challenge then of these 5 I want to talk about? Building a global evidence base. When we talk about inequalities in access and success in higher education across the world, we know that we have evidence is conclusive that they exist. They exist in every country in the world. We did some work 6 or 7 years ago looking at all the available data on who participates in higher education by social background across the world. In all the countries we could find data, that was 90% or so. In every country, there's inequalities by either socioeconomic background, but particularly socioeconomic background, ethnicity, location, morality, disability, etc. But what do we know particularly about the nature of these divides and inequalities? Who is collecting this information systematically? The big challenge is that it's not being collected systematically, it's not being brought together in the global evidence base in terms of who is participating in higher education by social background. We know a lot about the gross enrollment ratios, but who is actually going to higher education, what the individual differences are across countries. That global evidence base needs developing. And we need some leadership, I'll speak later on the whole agenda, particularly when it comes to collecting data information systematically across the world. That's our first challenge, building a global evidence base in terms of who participates in higher education, what the inequalities are, particularly I'll say in a moment, how they're being addressed. Initiating more institutional commitment. Some institutions are engaged in this agenda in some countries. From our work in World Access to Higher Education Day in the past 5 years, we've worked in more than 1,000 organisations who've been involved in WAHED, and we found numerous instances of fantastic work going on by universities, great commitments in terms of both supporting their students into higher education and through higher education, from a myriad of different backgrounds, facing a plethora of different inequalities. But many are not engaged in this agenda. I pose a question here. Why isn't every university member of the IAU committing a minimum of 1% of its budget to equitable access work? It may well be doing so. We don't have the evidence base. My hypothesis is they're not. It's no point us having a conversation like this that starts by telling us how well we are doing, because there's fantastic work going on. Both all my colleagues around the table are doing that work, but there's so much more to do. Initiating institutional commitment is my second challenge. The third one, making it matter to policymakers. As part of WAHED, with the support of Lumina Foundation in the US and the Asia Europe Foundation based out of Singapore, we have collected information and data on the policies that over 100 countries are pursuing where equitable access and success is concerned. If you go onto our website there, the World Access HE, the WAHED and WAHED website, you will see the global equity map. You can look at the information we have, the latest we've managed to collect on equitable access and success policies in these different countries. Looking at the policies and information overall, we will find that only a very small amount of countries have targets related to participation in higher education by equity target groups. Only a very small amount have specific strategies. Yet virtually all countries mention equity in their higher education overall policies. Yet very few have real strong commitments to pursuing this agenda. And making it matter to the policymakers is my third challenge. My fourth challenge is making higher education more affordable. That incorporates not just fees, but financial support. Because the OECD, around a quarter of fees are low, a quarter are moderate, and about half about to OECD apparently are high. But a large variation in grants and loans, support, etc. You sometimes think that, okay, in the countries where, in my country, as many will know, we have perhaps per capita and most expensive fee regime in the world. Yet we do actually have quite a lot of financial support available for students to enter beside the fees compared to other countries, even though there's much work to do in my own country. It's not just about fees, it's the overall financial support regime of grants and loans, support, etc. Particularly the issue across the global south, pressures on public institutions to meet costs passed on as fees, and the growth in private institutions. I'll share two little snippets here. Many of you will take University World News, I'm sure, which is a fantastic resource, comes out every Sunday, bringing together news and information on higher education across the world. It's in just this week's UWN. In Kenya, public institutions launched a new push to triple tuition fees, not because they want to charge their students more, but to enable them to be financially sustainable. They're having to try and increase their fees. That's in Kenya. The next step from this week's UWN, over in Pakistan, private universities cannot be told to cut fees. Private universities are a key part of the landscape across the world, particularly in the global south. They're able to increase the capacity where governments can't afford to. Yeah, how can we ensure that there's affordability across both the private and public higher education offering? That's my fourth challenge, affordability. My final challenge is finding leadership. So on to WAHED. We began WAHED 5 years ago as an international day of action, a catalyst to address inequalities in higher education access and success. We've engaged over 1,000 organisations, enabled 200 events on WAHED days. We've held the past 3 years some fantastic, very well attended online conferences. On the back of that, we launched WAHED. Since WAHED, we've had less than 15 members. Across the world, 15 organisations want to join WAHED. This leads us to talk about what leadership really means. We've attempted in NEON to provide our contribution to global leadership. NEON's an organisation with less than 3 members, 3 full-time members. The past 2 years, we ran WAHED on the back of what we normally do, essentially for nothing. So who will address these challenges? This year's WAHED, or maybe our last WAHED, unless we can generate enough resources to take it forward. Because, so that's my final question. We're only one small part of the global matrix, but we really need leadership on this agenda. We've tried in NEON via WAHED, and we hope to continue WAHED if we can. And please, if you can register, because it's still free to attend WAHED this year. We have a fantastic conference. We've got speakers from the World Bank, the Association of Qualified Universities, UNESCO's organisation. I mean, Francesca's kindly providing speakers and support again, as well as other leading organisations across the world. So it's it's the one online conference globally on equity, specifically equity and access that actually exists. And it's free to attend, but contribute please if you can. But my final question is leadership. Who will provide the leadership we need to address the 4 other challenges I've laid out today? Those are my comments, Andreas.
You are a member of the middle class, then you get like a financial boost. But if you are really in a vulnerable group, then I'm afraid to say that it is very rare where you can see that the amount of money that you are going to get is really going to make a difference. Okay, so we have really a problem here. We have systems, certainly, but those in place are not really looking towards the most vulnerable populations. Now, what is happening with these 4 new governments that I have already mentioned? Well, nothing new. I mean, nothing new, because I think that they once again come to the all same policies intended to boost access and participation to higher education. Basically, 4 different strategies which are combined in different ways. First of all, to create more public universities, then to try to diversify them. That means that not all of them are going to be real universities with this double head of being teaching and research institutions, but just teaching institutions. Then some funding for affirmative action, particularly to vulnerable groups, and finally, better financial support. But this is also creating new issues, at least as we have seen in these 4 countries. First of all, more universities without the financial and the fiscal, health that you need to push for more investment in higher education is really, going to imply a price in terms of quality. We have seen this already happening in Mexico. Now, diversification sounds very good because you can really boost participation at a lower cost, and certainly with programs that suit more the needs of the economic context you have, but it easily leads to the stratification of the higher education provision. So still you have universities and then the rest. Finally, affirmative action has been already on the rise in the region, not only in the 4 countries I have mentioned. And here we have detected that there is an information issue. And that's, these affirmative action programs can exist, but if the individuals, if the groups concerned cannot really get access to the information and do not know exactly how to benefit from them, this money is going to be lost. And finally, well, when it comes to the financial support systems, at least in Chile as well as in Colombia, the governments are struggling to cancel the debt, something that also resounds, what is going on in the United States. This is really a major issue because it's not only finding the necessary funds, to cancel the debt, is also a way of finding a way of really providing financial support under new innovative arrangements. So, I mean, it looks strange. It may look strange to many of us, but certainly canceling the debt, the student debt, is a very contentious political issue, with some political parties really taking really strong stakes against this cancellation policy. Now, things are moving very fast in this region, I suppose that in other regions as well. So it will be very interesting to see if by the end of next year, we can really provide the evidence Graham was calling for, and telling you to what extent some particular initiatives followed by these governments and others that may follow in the future are really making a difference, because that's what we really all want. Thank you very much for your attention, and back to you, Andreas.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Francesca. Really, really wonderful to get the data from the LAC region, and a wonderful counterpart also to the debate that we're having at this global level today. I was immediately struck also when you said that in terms of more universities being created in the LAC region, that the IAU has the pleasure of operating and maintaining the World Higher Education Database, and chance has it that we're just finished updating the LAC region. And what we also saw there was not only an explosion of universities in terms of numbers, but also in terms of private universities, moreover, private for-profit universities, especially in Brazil. So it is very, very interesting to understand also this enlargement of the higher education landscape in terms of quality and in terms of what kind of models are being serving the society, whether it's private, for-profit, whether it's public universities. So just a note there. It's Vivian, very much looking forward to your reflections, your thoughts. Indeed, Vivian is from the University of the Western Cape, and indeed in South Africa. And as we know, historically, for historical reasons and systemic reasons, in the sub-Saharan African area, South Africa plays a prominent and a predominant role in the discussion around and the narrative around access. And we're very, very much looking forward to your reflections on this. And especially because, Vivian, you actually give us the perspective from an institution, from the university itself, which is so much valued. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I've been listening with care to my the previous speakers, and I thought it would hopefully add some value from an institutional perspective, but also from a South African perspective. So I suffer a bit at this stage from PowerPoint fatigue, so I will be speaking, if you don't mind. And I'd be very happy, Andreas, to, after this, if anyone wants to have a copy of our framework, to share that with the participants that are here today. So my focus is on student retention success within our context. And as you can all imagine, it's a core concern at higher education institutions worldwide. And in the South African education system, the widening of access, high attrition, low throughput, and low completion rates highlight the vast disparities for students entering university. And depending on where you're sitting, I've listened with care now to the LAC countries, thanks Francesca. Depending on where you're sitting, student success and retention could take on various meanings, depending on your purpose and the context, and may I dare say your geographical context also play a huge role, culture, etc. And just in terms of a very brief context of South Africa, I'm sure you're aware that in 1994, the new democratic government inherited a higher education system that was fragmented, characterized by deep racial inequalities. And to address this, the government widened university access through increased enrollment, so massification in a sense, and especially to allow students from what we call disadvantaged communities to enter universities. And what we found was that many of our higher education institutions were underprepared to accommodate the diverse range of students in respect to age, race, and preparedness for academic studies. So as a consequence, this resulted in many South African institutions experiencing the following. As I said, low participation rates, high attrition, and low completion rates. And whilst we've seen the broadening of access, and I know that we're looking at numbers, there's also the importance of ensuring that access meets with the outcomes of student success and retention. So yes, we have increased our participation rates. We have provided more access to many disadvantaged students. But what we see even now in 2022, exacerbated by COVID, is that the racial disparities still exist. So even though we don't have a population registration system anymore, like in the apartheid era, when it comes to measurement of participation and of successful outcomes, we still use the same ethnic groups or racial groups, depending on your vantage point, of African, colored, someone that looks like me, Indian, and white. And that is then closely monitored to examine participation rates, success rates within university. And interestingly enough, present trends show that a very small proportion of African, colored, and Indian students graduate in regulation time. So regulation time would then mean if it's a 3-year degree in the minimum prescribed period, as you can imagine. What we've also seen nationally is that we have a very high first-year attrition rate at 33%. And then there's also a correlation, without going into the data at this stage, a correlation with racial disparities. So at the moment, so what do we do? At UWC, having come as a university that was intended in the apartheid years to be only for colored students, and that has reimagined itself as a non-racial institution, and currently described as a disadvantaged institution, because we had the advantage, mostly white, and then disadvantaged institutions. So UWC is a research-led institution. And when I joined as the Deputy Vice Chancellor Academic, one of my biggest priorities was around how do we improve on student success and retention at UWC? Knowing that we've got more than 91% Black, that includes African, colored, and Indian students, and having to understand exactly from student success and retention perspective, what it is that we could do to improve on those outcomes. So what did we do? As the first step, we did a trend analysis in using a cohort of 2010. We tracked them over 7 years and until 2016 in a sense. And in that study, we had roughly 4,547 students that participated. So what were we interested in? We wanted to know their movement year after year in all the degree programs. So we wanted to account for look at the data set to account for student losses, degree completion, graduation, demographics, attributes such as race, gender, what schools they come from, what school subjects that they do, their results, socioeconomic classification, whether they are on residence, whether they are commuting, where's their home province, because not all our students come from Cape Town, some of them come from the rural Eastern Cape areas, financial aid information. So what we then did was in support of that, we then looked at the quantitative data that I very briefly described. We then did a physical questionnaire, which we administered to, I think, about 54 returning students during the registration year of 2017. Now, remember, we tracked them over that 6-year period, and we wanted to know from the students what specific challenges from that cohort did they have. And we wanted to know information about the institution, our faculties, access to the kind of environment at the institution, their living arrangements, all of that. So what did the cohort study provide us? It provided us with a program-based view of the patterns of attrition and success on a year-by-year basis. It provided us with the problem of student attrition and delayed completion within the institution. And it provided us with, it exposed the areas and the stages where students were struggling, where they were most at risk and where they were at risk of dropouts. And so the data provided, the combination, provided new knowledge for us on student risk factors. And I thought, if I combine what Graham and Francesc mentioned, and you look at it systemically, this is what our students were telling us. What were their risk factors? These included unmet financial needs, their socioeconomic conditions related to their having living conditions that were not conducive to studying, the need to work part-time, that there's quite a big portion of our students that need to supplement their income to finance their studies, their schooling experience, the community that they come from, but they also showed us institutional factors. And that was quite an interesting dimension. They showed us through the lens of their student experience around the perceived quality of our orientation programs, our academic and non-academic support services, the engagement opportunities that they're having on campus and off campus. And so began the elements of retention strategy and framework for UWC. In summarizing this, we used Peter Lanfe's general systems theory. Even though it's old, it really helped us to put all of these elements together. And we conceptualized those challenges and we offset those to understanding the impact of each element, whether it's policies, teaching and learning, student engagement, support, finance, curriculum, assessment within the system, and how that interconnects with the other role players within our university system, bringing them together. And I'd be very happy to share, post this, just a graphic representation of that framework. It's got 3 layers, quite importantly for us. The first layer is seeing UWC as a caring and inclusive environment. The second layer is the learning and teaching environment, and then the support environment. And when we unpack that in its design, our student retention success framework, which received institutional approval in 2018 and really set us up for the COVID pandemic, we recognize that the landscape of student success is complex, it's multifaceted, and that there are various factors that impact on whether our students can be retained and how smooth their transition is from pre to post into the working environment. And so what was interesting, we overlaid this in the first layer of UWC as a caring and inclusive environment with a very deep student voice, because we learned more from our students and from just the raw data on the system. And we take them in the student walk from pre-UWC, transitioning first year, later years, up to graduation and lifelong learning. And in the second layer, what was quite important that we saw that you cannot really separate these things was to look at the learning teaching part. How do we track and monitor? How do we review and evaluate? And is our infrastructure actually matching what we need? So not just in terms of human resources, but also in terms of our learning spaces beyond what is in a classroom environment. And I think COVID brought that very starkly back home. So we in a sense track the student's journey and look at how the institution supports that transitioning through that. In closing, I want to say that one thing I've learned, I had the, I would probably say dubious, but a unique honor of having led the university as Vice Chancellor, as well, acting Vice Chancellor for 6 months, as well as my own role as Deputy Vice Chancellor when the pandemic started. So I had these two roles, and probably once in a lifetime, it will never happen again that I will do two jobs at the same time, at such a time. And one thing I've learned, and this framework prepared us for that, once you've distilled your principles, how you then translate from your key principles into real action becomes much easier, because then there's institutional buy-in into your principles. And so our framework has 8 principles, which I will briefly read, which everybody knows about. And then 3 take-homes from me, then I'll leave it at that. So what are these principles? Number 1, student success is everybody's business. Doesn't matter if you're an academic, if you're a registrar, if you're finance, if you're an administrative or support staff, it's everyone's business at the university. Secondly, student success must become central to the mission of the institution. Thirdly, taking action is as important as reflection and analytic insights. Fourth, student success initiatives require mutual engagement of students and the university. Translate what we know into institutional action to achieve substantial improvement. And in the 6th place, engage in ongoing monitoring and evaluation of the impact of the framework over time. And this has become a living document for us so that we can track its impact. As I said before, in number 7, human resources and other financial resources are important investments into student success and retention. And then probably the biggest one for me, work across silos in a systemic and integrated approach with an effective implementation management and coordinated plan. So what are my 3 take-homes? 1, the institutional student retention and success framework brings sharply into focus the significance of the interdependence and interrelatedness of the university systems and structures, which influence each other directly or indirectly. You cannot disentangle them in a sense. Secondly, any actions taken by the institution are as critical to actions taken in the classroom and by student support services to enhance student success and completion. And thirdly, working collaboratively within the framework and across university silos will allow the institution to be more effective in promoting student retention, completion, and success. And a topic for another day, we've reflected on how exactly that last part helped us during the COVID-19 pandemic to ensure that we could have a successful completion, especially of 2020, 21, and 2022. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Vivian, what a rich presentation. Thank you very, very much. And indeed, I'm very, very glad because you zoomed in on the second part of the title of today's webinar on success and retention, and you did so incredibly well. I have to say I'm very, very impressed by the framework that you just described, this very deep matrix that you presented to us, and I'm glad I'm sure we'll follow up on details of that in a moment. It is my great pleasure now to give the floor to Nino Schmidt in Zagreb, and indeed he will be talking to us about his experience as the chair of the Bologna follow-up group social dimension. Nino, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Oh, by the way, just let me say, if you have questions out there, please do type away and put it into the chat function. We will try and pick them up towards the panel discussion after Nino's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I would just...
My experience is different. I'm a first generation student in my family, PhD, and that wasn't how it was supposed to be. And I'm not the only one. And so I don't think there's a golden yardstick around merit, but rather how one looks at flexible ways of participation within the system. And that is where I find that in our institution, for example, we have the symbol that it's the institution where the child of a domestic worker, a cleaner, can become a graduate. And that is a social construct, and it's something that drives us as an institution. So it doesn't have to be either or. You can look at things such as recognition of prior learning, which I think is still underutilized in some institutions, anyway, in South Africa. And we've made that a very, very important part of, not just for undergraduate studies, but also for postgraduate studies, because you also have the national needs that we want to improve or increase on our postgraduate outcomes, and to have a better ratio of undergrad and postgrad. So I don't think we'll probably get away from, we can debate this till the cows come home, in the sense around whether you need merit or not. I think there is a middle way, and as long as we have, like we've now have a flexible learning and teaching provisioning policy, and the provisioning part is where you look at flexible ways of entry. And there, I think there is some work to be done. And I'm hoping that you guys can come and visit South Africa and come and visit our institution and see what interesting stuff we're doing around making this, the RPL part of it, very interesting.
Thank you very much. Nino, may I just move on, because there have been a few questions also in the chat. And one is a very straightforward one on how did you get institutions to adopt your 10 principles of social dimension and participate in that system of monitoring? And then there's a very interesting thing, and I do want to make note of it, because he does bring in Bruno Latour, and we are very sad to have heard of his death. I think it was yesterday that Bruno Latour died, the great French thinker and philosopher. And here Peter Lally comes in with a cheeky question. The great French thinker Bruno Latour has just passed away, and this is one of his famous points, was that social could etymologically mean whatever kind of connections there are, but it has come to mean the right kind of connections. It reminds me also of the social capital notion of Bourdieu. For example, social work means remedial work towards improving society. Does the Bologna social dimension really accept local contexts, including local social fabrics and traditions, or are the modernizing normative values of equity and diversity more dominant? Sure, that was quite a long question, and I'm not sure you got all of it unless you got to see it in the questions. And did you get to see it, Nino?
Yes, but I'll be very brief in
Excellent.
answering it. I would say that the novelty in the principles for social dimension is that we've introduced the principle related to community engagement in higher education, which means basically that the higher education institutions are supposed to work closely with their local communities to satisfy the needs of these local communities. So I would say that through this principle, the Bologna shows the importance of locality and the importance that the higher education institutions work closely with their citizens on a local level. However, this principle has been implemented maybe like a third of the countries. So we need a space for big improvement. And your first question, how come that the countries agreed to adopt the principles? I would say that the key was that the process was very inclusive since the very beginning, and it lasted, I mean, it's still basically in the process, but it has lasted 4 years, and through these 4 years, there was really a huge a process of consultations on different levels. And I think it will be the key in every member state that the public authorities enter into the consultation with higher education institutions and their local communities on how the principles should be implemented in the practice in particular member states. Andreas?
Thank you very much, Nino. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I have done a few of these webinars over time, of course, but seldom has time gone so quickly, and that really speaks to the quality of the presentations and the speakers today. I think I can only wrap up and say that my takeaway is that we've only touched the iceberg of this very, very important discussion on access and success in higher education. What I am taking away that there is a plethora of social, cultural, economic factors that make or break access and success in higher education. Perhaps one takeaway that we have not rested on a lot, but it has come up in discussions, is of course also the playing field, or one of the great levelers of the debate. Has to do with primary and secondary education. It's obvious. The better the primary and secondary tuition, the better you will also have, at least to a mechanism to alleviate some of the social factors that we spoke about today. And that, of course, that takes us to a whole educational sector approach. And there, Francesca, you said it yourself, LLL, lifelong learning, must be included. So primary, secondary, tertiary, and LLL must be all part of all discussion in order to overcome the challenges that stand between us and a successful access and success in higher education. Thank you very, very much for this very rich discussion. It's been a great pleasure. My name is Andreas Corcoran, and this was one of the IAU webinars on the futures of education. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for taking part. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, Francesca, Nino.
Bye.